Is it hot in here? Or is it just me? Gentle modern apes from all across the internet on this sweltering summer day, we are going to be addressing what, in my humble opinion, is the most devastating blow to young Earth creationism. Heat. Now, given this is, of course, a channel that focuses on all of the cool ins and outs of anthropology, paleontology, zoology, and, of course, more specifically, primates, including ourselves, this may come as somewhat of a surprise, at least hearing it from me, that the death blow to such an ideology as creationism comes not from perhaps our unplaceable ancestors, or even our lovely and well-organized fossil record, but from our friends over at chemistry, physics, and math, the dark side of the STEM fields. The reason we appeal to the darker sides of the STEM fields for our OHKOs, our home runs, our death knells for creationism, is because creationists are very good at looking at the life sciences and accusing them of being open to interpretation, the same evidence fallacy that AIG likes to throw out there. Unfortunately for them, math, physics, and chemistry aggressively preclude creationism and a global flood, and they do so with just basic equations. This is why we consider this, in particular, to be the final blow to this drowning hypothesis of young Earth creationism. When numbers come onto the scene, numbers which have no choice but to obey the laws of physics that we understand to be unbroken on our little rock, we see creationists engage in either the panicked skittering so well known to a dying hypothesis, or a steadfast admission of a superheated problem that requires a miracle to resolve. Of course, the latter pulls a foundational card from the house that is creation science, rendering it an appeal to a phenomenon perhaps present but never empirically observed. My friends at the Standing for Truth Brain Trust, a creationist YouTube channel, have taken the route of the former, hitching their proverbial wagon to the idea that not only is creation 6,000 years ago and a global flood sometime after that possible, but that heat isn't really a problem thanks to the hypothesis put forth by Walt, the hydroplate theory. This theory is a general attempt to explain the geologic column through Noah's flood, including all the fossils, the current position of all the continents, the cratering of the moon and Earth, and why radiometric dating tells us that the Earth is very ancient. But before we really get into things, I really want to hammer in the implication of the data that I am going to present today. Without appealing to a miracle, young Earth creationists cannot cope with the enormous amount of heat that would result from their worldview, both the 6,000-year creation and, of course, the global flood. This means creationism is not only not supported by science, but that science precludes every aspect of it. It is, in essence, dead on arrival. So, what's the deal with the heat, huh? Well, thanks to the work of the chemists and the physicists, we know that many interactions in our world release heat as a product. Key to our point today, heat is released when elements decay, when the continents slide around on top of the mantle, when minerals deposit and harden, when volcanoes spit ejecta, and when asteroids strike the planet's surface. In conventional science, we have 4.5 to 4.8 billion years to diffuse heat from all of the observed processes above. But creationists need to cram all of that into a 4,400 to 10,000 year time span. That's 450,000 to 480,000 times smaller of a time frame. Because of this, many creationists suggest that the catastrophic flood of Noah, as listed in the Bible, was the catalyst for the observed phenomena above. During the flood, they propose, decay sped up, the continents moved faster, the minerals cemented more quickly, volcanoes were rampant, and impacts more common. So to be very clear, they suggest that all the heat from a 4.5 to 4.8 billion year old Earth is crammed into around a single year during this grand and watery apocalypse. The two most popular hypotheses that kind of outline the series of events that occurred to cause the Noachian deluge are called the Hydroplate theory by Walt Brown and the catastrophic plate tectonics theory, which is touted by pretty much every other creationist that's not Walt Brown, including the organizations Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research. Old Walt's central thesis is that only a few thousand years ago, the Earth's entire crust consisted of a large and unbroken granite slab that was 20 to 60 miles thick. Until recently, he claimed it was around 10 miles thick. This slab was suspended over a large reservoir of highly pressurized water. According to Brown, due to centuries of tidal pumping from the moon's gravity, the crust suddenly cracked and burst open, violently releasing the subterranean water and flooding the entire Earth. He argues that large masses of rock and water were ejected into outer space during this massive eruption, creating all of the asteroids, comets, and meteoroids in our solar system. He further claims that the immense slabs of broken crust, which he calls hydroplates, undulated, heaved, and slid thousands of miles in a matter of months or less, and then crashed into each other to form the mountains within hours. If this sounds absolutely bonkers impossible, that's because it is. Brown indicates that he is, of course, the, quote, director of the Center for Science Creation, unquote, in Arizona, which apparently consists of two people, Walt Brown and his wife. Of course, Brown's flood model and the associated claims are overwhelmingly rejected by conventional scientists, and they strongly conflict with all of the lines of evidence we have from the Earth and the solar system that suggest a very long and complex history of around 4.5 to 4.8 billion years. Detailed critiques of Brown's flood model, based on earlier editions of his book, have been made by Lepard in 1989 and in 1990, and by Jellison in 2009, while one or more of his specific claims have been refuted over and over again by others, including Bacall, Fleming, Kubin, Matson, Morton, Sharp, and Van Til. Point-by-point refutations of many of Brown's claims can be found in numerous locations, including Rational Wiki. Although Brown's flood model has garnered some considerable popularity among lay creationists, many young Earth creationist authors, and including major groups such as Answers in Genesis, CMI, and the Institute for Creation Research, have rejected or strongly dunked on it, refuting many of his more outrageous arguments. Thanks to some of these criticisms, including those by Glenn Kubin, Brown has removed a few of the more glaring errors from his 2018 revised 9th edition, such as those regarding the shrinking sun, missing neutrinos, and the classic Japanese plesiosaur. But disturbingly, the most glaring errors, of course, have been kept. On the other hand, we have the catastrophic plate tectonics hypothesis, which is, of course, all the fun of hydroplate minus the lunar bukkake. Now, this one, CPT, is the hypothesis that most creationist organizations subscribe to. This would be the Alpha Chad mainstream hypothesis for your AIGs, your ICRs, your creation.coms. Which is a good thing, because proponents of the CPT at least have the wherewithal to admit that there is this enormous heat problem. And when they are faced with that, they do in fact concede that there is no current way to get rid of all of that heat. They've gotten their guys on it, they've realized they've got an issue, and they're appealing to typically either miracles or that exotic solutions are going to be found in the future. Now, because hydroplate hypothesis is the only flood model that is not currently appealing to divine intervention, we're going to go ahead and investigate it a bit more deeply and decide for ourselves precisely why it just doesn't work. On this journey, we are going to be consulting and looking to physicists and geologists, both from conventional science and from creationist camps. Those creationist camps, of course, being the ones that reject the hydroplate hypothesis in favor of CPT on the basis that hydroplate is just completely bananas. And given that hydroplate hypothesis, as stated by Walt Brown, does not need to appeal to miracles because it can handle the heat problem all on its own, it's claiming to be fully scientific, and thus it is of course ripe for criticism. It should come as no surprise, of course, that proponents of the hydroplate hypothesis, including Standing for Truth and the SFT Brain Trust, have responded to the criticisms of hydroplate in general. The response, of course, is no more substantial than the original claims that Walt Brown's idea makes, and we're going to, today, together, investigate the nitty-gritty reasons why together. I invite Standing for Truth, Brian Nichol, and his, of course, channel in general, and Walt Brown himself, to investigate the equations, the math, and the claims that I'm making here in this critical assessment, and then to take a swing at the monumental problems for their hypothesis so that they may fix it, and of course put it forward for peer review once more, as science should go. In Walt Brown's original pre-flood world, the granitic crust that holds back these fountains of the deep is somewhere between 10 and 60 miles thick, depending on the location of the crust referred to and the decade that you're asking Walt Brown the question. It used to be that Brown held to a smooth granitic crust, but Morton in 2003 pointed out that the biblical account requires mountains. So now Brown suggests the existence of enormous pillars of granite that formed sometime in day 2 or 3 of the creation week, thanks to the sagging of the original smooth granitic crust. Of course, there is no support via experiment or observation that granite can act like what is essentially a putty without extreme heat and vast amounts of time, especially on such a large scale, and Brown cannot afford a greater heat problem, as we shall soon see. But for our purposes, we will grant Walt Brown his odd crust, because we have bigger fish to vaporize. The underground oceans, or fountains of the deep, are proposed to have burst forth all across the Earth in a pattern not unlike the seam of a baseball, somewhere in the vicinity of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. As previously mentioned, this is proposed to have been the result of tidal pumping, and was thus inevitable given the location of the moon. This may beg the question, what if Adam and Eve had not sinned? Would the globe have eventually ruptured regardless? Given the nature of an unbroken crust sealing in hyperpressurized and thus superheated water, any earthquake, no matter how slight, would have popped the seal on the planet and initiated the global flood. This is highly problematic given what we know about plate tectonics, which is why it appears that Brown and his supporters just don't accept that the plates have always been moving, which of course they have been and still currently are thanks to mantle convection. We know this in part because Precambrian rock, or pre-flood rock if you're a creationist, is simply wrought with fault lines. Now, before you suggest that these fault lines are perhaps the result of the fountains of the Great Deep bursting forth, understand that they are not in the right places according to Walt Brown's model. This pre-flood rock also contains microfossils, which makes one wonder, why does perfectly created rock prior to sin and death have small, dead things in it? But let us assume for a moment that the innumerable fault lines and microfossils are not a problem for Brown and company, and that we just have that super mega fault line right where Walt needs it. To be clear, we don't have those things, but what if we did? Then what would we be looking at? Walt supposes that all the water spewing forth did so with so much immense power that it broke up the single granitic crust, blowing chunks of Earth sky high, where it eventually created all of the craters in the solar system. His supporter, Brian Nichol, cites the fact that small bits of Earth ejecta have been found on the moon. Of course, further examination finds that we find tiny bits of Earth rock on the moon, but that it is composed of the mineral slurry geologists have long proposed Earth was made up of at the time that it impacted the ancient planet Theia, and formed the moon several billion years ago. A peppering of Earth rock seems to fit more with this hypothesis, given in Walt's version all of the craters were caused by Earth ejecta just 4,400 years ago, meaning that the moon should be dripping with Earth material, particularly given it has no atmosphere to aid in burning up incoming impacts. But what if all the craters in the solar system were from Earth rock ejecting violently from the surface some 4,400 years ago? Well, Sharp in 2005 calculated it, and the answer he got is that the energy required just to get all of the still orbiting asteroids to their current location would be equivalent to approximately 20 trillion hydrogen bombs.
Even more energy and heat would have been involved if one includes in the calculations the energy needed to launch all of the material in order to explain all of the other comets, asteroids, and meteoroids that have impacted the various planets and moons of our entire solar system, which of course is evidenced by the millions of craters on many of them, and others that of course impacted the sun and gaseous planets or have escaped into outer space. It's just a mess. Even YEC author Danny Faulkner in 2013 of Answers in Genesis demonstrated that the heat involved in the eruption phase alone would have been many times beyond the lethal limit to all life on Earth. In a video on Brown's own page, and in the online draft of his 9th edition, Brown himself states that the energy released during the hydroplate eruptions would have exceeded 300 trillion atomic bombs. This makes it even more implausible that Noah and his cargo, and indeed any macroscopic or microscopic life on Earth for that matter, would have survived under the proposed hydroplate eruptions.
At this point, we should probably go ahead and give Brian Nichol his due and allow for some of the rebuttals he's proposed for these mounting and superheated problems. First of all, Brian Nichol supposes that all of this heat had around 40 days to dissipate, given that's about the time that it took for the rain to stop. Of course, that doesn't help too much,
because physicist Gerald Jellison calculated that if only 0.001% of the mass and energy of the eruptions wound up in Earth's atmosphere, the atmosphere alone would have been raised by 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. For perspective, the most heat-tolerant eukaryotes on the planet today are the Pompeii worms, which can withstand temperatures around 176 degrees Fahrenheit or 80 degrees Celsius. Compared to this, the most heat-tolerant prokaryotes here today are the thermophilic archaea, which can manage at temperatures between 106 and 252 degrees Fahrenheit or 41 and 122 degrees Celsius. Of course, Jellison was being very generous to Brown, since leaving only 1% of the heat on Earth would still be thoroughly untenable. After all, Brown's theory holds that many cubic miles of super hot, sediment-laden water gushed through miles more of solid rock, then entire oceans, and then miles more of atmosphere. Even if his proposed forces allowed that, they could not occur without huge amounts of friction, turbulence, and steam release, as well as the condensation on Earth, all involving massive amounts of energy and heat left on the planet. Indeed, according to Brown's own descriptions, diagrams, and videos, the eruptions or jets did not shoot up in these tight vertical spouts or planes, and even if they did, the massive friction and steam release would still occur, but rather they spewed out violently both upward and outward as fountains, with a lot of water and debris simply falling back down to Earth as extreme rain. This means Brian Nichol's directed heat solution doesn't even seem to apply to Walt's hypothesis, and neither does his proposal that only the boundaries or sides of the water columns would transfer heat. Additionally, Nichol calculates temperatures of the great deep waters at the end of the expansion as if it was a perfect gas. He fails to take into account that steam condensates and becomes a fluid. Even if the conditions were as Nichol wants them so desperately to be, it still doesn't work. See, the energy required to jettison Earth rocks to the Moon and Mars, and indeed all the way past Neptune, according to Walt's own model, is absolutely bonkers. It's 9,300 times greater than the energy released upon the second greatest impact ever recorded on Earth. All this to say, directed heat, boundary conditions, and 40 days worth of time, hell, give them the whole year, could not even begin to mitigate that level of heat. And that's just for ejecting everything. What about when it comes back down?
Physicist Gerald Jellison calculated that the mass of all of the particles, and indeed water vapor, that would have been expelled from the Earth's surface just to explain all of the asteroids, the meteorites, and the comets in our solar system alone would be over 100 times greater than the mass of the entire Earth. So that then and there just goes ahead and precludes hydroplate hypothesis right on its head. But let's grant them that impossibility as well and see where it takes us.
There are around 50 recognized craters larger than 8 kilometers in diameter, each capable of at the very least causing their own nuclear winter. All those craters have 40 days to fall back down into their respective strata, all flood layers of course, along with the hundreds of millions of smaller meteors, given we currently have thousands hit our atmosphere per day. The large-scale impact that we know the most about is the one that left the Chicxulub crater, which has a fairly decent range as far as what its energy release was, anywhere between 1.3 times 10 raised 24 and 5.8 times 10 raised 25 joules. If we take the conditions of the Chicxulub impact and scale them for the top 10 and top 40 impact events known to us, we get an enormous amount of energy, the high end of which nearly boils the seas without help from any other aspect of Hydroplate. The lower and median numbers are still impressive and would have been quite a lot of heat to add to the mix, and this is just concerning the top 10 and top 40, so this is to say nothing of the millions of other impacts given, as I said previously, we do have thousands entering our atmosphere each and every day. Credit to my engineer friend Dakota for performing calculations.
Space as a heat sink and air as an insulator have both been suggested by Brian Nichol as a means to mitigate the heat as a problem. Essentially, when all of that water from the Great Deep got up to space, to the exosphere, it had enough time to cool off and come down as hail. That's how cold it would have gotten, as proposed by Brian. And of course, air acting as an insulator, given thinsulate is used to keep heat inside homes. But both of these ideas have a lot of problems, and most of them are due to misuse by Nichol.
Concerning space, to even attempt to reach those heights at supersonic speeds, the spouts would need to be like jets, not fountains, as Brown initially suggests. But even if they were jets, they could only reach said speeds via a de Laval nozzle, which itself requires another mechanism for formation that Nichol has not provided. He has also provided no math with regard to how high up the water reached before falling back down, or how it would overcome air resistance at that speed. Escape velocity for Earth is around 33 times the speed of sound, but the water could not have all been at escape velocity because most of it has to fall back down as rain. This means that the water that falls back down is not passing the exosphere and escaping into space, which is where Nichol gets his negative 450 degrees Fahrenheit from. The highest it can go is around the thermosphere, which can be up to 4,400 degrees Fahrenheit. The air there is also very thin, a fact that exacerbates the mounting problems as there is no means by which the water can stay in liquid form. Basically, by the point the water reaches the thermosphere, it is water vapor that will no longer precipitate and cannot go any higher, so space is lost as a heat sink mechanism. Brown himself admits that much of the ejecta would not make it off of Earth, meaning all of the heat from those particular events is staying in the water, atmosphere, and crust. Of the water that does make it up to the thermosphere and falls back down, there is heat exchange with the environment all the way up. Thin bands of air can insulate quite well, as Nichol suggests, but open air is known for readily accepting heat and transfer. As mentioned by Jellison, we could grant that space takes care of 999% of heat, assuming that it gets up there, which it wouldn't, and the atmosphere would still be superheated. Meanwhile, also based on Brown's own description, after the initial rupture phase, the subsequent undulating, crashing, sinking, and sliding of the continent-sized hydroplates would have produced enormous amounts of heat and friction as continent-sized plates sped across the planet within weeks, and entire mountain ranges were pushed up within, as Brown puts it, hours.
Still, more heat, which Brown himself refers to as massive, would have been released due to these massive magma outpourings from widespread volcanic activity. Now, in the light of all of this energy and heat from all of the ejecta going up, and then the ejecta coming back down, and then the continents sliding all over the place, all of the heat from the deposition of various rocks and minerals, it's starting to feel like our problem is a lot more than 0.0001% of that initial number, which again would on its own be lethal to all life on Earth.
So why is that subterranean water so hot? Well, Brown indicates that due to nuclear decay and tidal pumping, the waters became immensely hot and pressurized and took on special properties to become supercritical water. Taking into account the temperatures needed to produce objects known as chondrules in meteorites, which of course Brown believes came from Earth, he suggested that the temperature of the supercritical water must have reached over 1300 degrees Fahrenheit. He also states that the volume of the water in the lower chambers was about the same as the oceans above. The problem is, if the lower and upper waters mixed even a small amount during the flood, which would have been inevitable, the oceans would have been turned into boiling cauldrons, killing virtually all sea life. Brown and Nickel also appeal to this supercritical water for much of the geologic column, citing that supercritical fluids allow for easier deposition. Of course, this doesn't appear to take limestone into account, which only deposits as temperatures drop, generally requiring warm and calm waters to fall out of solution. So the fountains of the Great Deep, due to pressure, tidal pumping, and nuclear reactions, are ridiculously hot. They heat up the atmosphere when they jet into the skies, and they heat up the seas once the waters are high enough to cover them. But let's revisit the why of those superheated waters briefly.
How did it heat to that high of a level, you might be asking? What could possibly heat this magical layer of the fountains of the Great Deep under a enormously thick granitic crust to such high temperatures if we're not dealing with a molten mantle as accepted by conventional geology? And the answer is proposed to be deuterium fusion, which is a nuclear reaction.
He suggests that the amount of nuclear energy added to the subterranean water over several weeks by forming deuterium was equal to, quote, the energy released by 1,800 trillion 1 megaton hydrogen bombs, unquote. To grasp the sheer enormity of that number, let us note that the entire volume of the Earth's oceans is around 1.3 billion cubic kilometers. If the math is correct, that would mean that if even 1% of the proposed energy were left on Earth, which is of course very generous to Brown, it would still leave the equivalent of almost 14 H-bombs for every cubic kilometer of seawater. Evidently not seeing a problem with that, even though it would be enough to vaporize the oceans many times over, Brown suggests that the 1,800 trillion figure is still a conservative estimate because other products of nuclear fission and decay would have additional energy, and some water was expelled permanently from the Earth. So once again, even using minute fractions of the heat that would actually result from these events, we still get what is essentially the detonation of the planet.
So far, we have a few non-applicable heat mitigation methods by Nickel in order to explain the waters of the Great Deep shooting upwards along with, enormous amounts of ejecta from the planet's surface, and then no mitigation proposals for the heat and energy released upon the entry and re-impact of all of that ejected Earth matter from the continents sliding all around like it's a bumper car rink, or for the deposition of various minerals. If you are perhaps Walt Brown himself, Brian Nickel, or maybe Standing for Truth, and you want to propose that actually those proposed methods do mitigate the enormous heat problem, then please do fling all of that sweet math my way. #release the math. And before you propose that these calculations have been done already, know that I have already sought them out, and I have come back empty-handed. And that's after listening to Brian Nickel speak on Real Science Radio for a very, very long time on how great these heat mitigation methods were, although no math was provided, and nary a digit was found. If you want to do science with the big boys, with the big physics boys, then you gotta bring some numbers. Otherwise, you're gonna get laughed out of the building. So let's sink our canines into this whole accelerated decay thing, shall we?
First and foremost, all methods of radiometric dating are rooted in the principle that atoms of some chemical elements will spontaneously decay into atoms of another. This is a law in physics known as the radioactive decay law, and it applies to all radioactive isotopes. We measure the ratio of pre-decay atoms to post-decay atoms in order to date igneous rocks, thanks to known half-lives, or the time that it takes for half of the original sample to decay into the end products. Half-lives do not change in meaningful ways in nature, a fact known in part thanks to the natural nuclear reactors such as the one found at OHKO. In fact, cramming 4.5 to 4.8 billion years of decay into a single year, or 40 days for that matter, would result in every square kilometer of Earth's surface being heated to 70,000 degrees Celsius. For scope, this is 152 times hotter than the surface of Venus. We will revisit specifically the accuracy of radiometric dating at another time, as it deserves its own video, but for now, understand that the process is solid, corroborated by dendrochronology, VARV dating, ice cores, dust layers, coral growth rates, natural reactors, electroconductivity layers, calcite layers, chemostratigraphy, white dwarf cooling dating, globular cluster ages, and the speed of light itself. Radiometric dating is so solid that our entire fossil fuel industry relies on the dates and the evolutionary timescale in order to locate rich deposits, and that's a $247 billion a year industry.
This is obviously an enormous problem for young Earth creationists, so Answers in Genesis went ahead and hired a crack team of young Earth creationist geologists and physicists, which was disbanded shortly after it was created back in 2005, where they had to admit
that a young Earth position cannot be reconciled with the scientific data without assuming that exotic solutions will be discovered in the future. No known thermodynamic process could account for the required rate of heat removal, nor is there any known way to protect organisms from radiation damage." Unquote. This is still the case in 2018, based off of the International Conference of Creation Research, which admitted that the heat from continental movement, sedimentation, and accelerated decay would be enough to melt the Earth's crust a dozen times over and boil off its oceans 28 times over.
But while most young Earth creationist organizations have admitted that there is indeed this massive heat problem that can't be solved by any current means, and thus it is probably an exotic future solution that has yet to be discovered, or a miracle, Walt and our boys who support him suggest something else entirely. They suggest that heat is not a problem at all from accelerated decay, or from those continents sliding all across the surface like it's a bumper car rink, because they suggest this problem is fixed by underground lightning. And yes, I am serious.
Walt Brown appeals to a process known in physics as the piezoelectric effect, or the ability of some geologic materials to generate an electric charge when under mechanical stress. This effect is the reason that we can sometimes see lightning when earthquakes occur, and that's generally pretty cool in its own right.
So you might be thinking to yourself, what does underground lightning have to do with accelerated nuclear decay? Good question. Someone ask Walt that.
The actual proposed mechanism by Walt Brown goes something like this. Particle accelerators can be used to create enormously powerful electrical fields that can then manipulate subatomic material. Brian Nichols cites a paper from 1998 and excitedly remarks that the half-life of rhenium was altered from 44 billion years to just 33 years. Of course, in that experiment, a particle accelerator was used alongside numerous other preparatory methods in order to manually strip rhenium of all of its electrons. Let us consider for a moment what has really been done here. Nickel has cited a paper that applied over 370 million electron volts to the element rhenium, and through a dozen or so steps, including the use of foil to remove remaining electrons, showed that lethally high electrical fields can rip electrons from elements and result in something that looks quite a bit like hydrogen. Additionally, the work done by the author concerns the process of nucleosynthesis, or the formation of elements in the unfathomably lethal conditions of a star's belly. Interestingly enough, the study cited by Nickel is actually used in aiding the estimates for the unbelievably old age of the universe.
But to summarize, the hydroplate proponents think that because modern earthquakes can generate lightning that typically clocks around 10,000 electron volts each, that the tectonic movement of the Noachian deluge must have produced lightning that generated 35,000 1,000 times that number in order to strip the electrons off of geologically relevant elements, mimicking a process that creates elements in the cores of stars. Come on, guys, it's not that complicated. It's fine. I mean, it's fine.
The Hydroplate supporters need this method as they hold to the idea that God would not have included radioactive materials in the original perfect creation, so all radioactivity must originate during the flood. Of course, now we must ask, why is there uranium in pre-flood rock? We must also ask a few more pressing questions. Why does the piezoelectric effect, when observed in experimental conditions, not spur the stripping of electrons? And why don't we find accelerated decay at earthquake sites and fault lines, where Brown supposes the effect is seen? I imagine their responses will be something along the lines of, quote, Noah's flood was simply much more catastrophic, and nothing we see today could even begin to mimic it, unquote.
Well, as a preemptive answer, the piezoelectric effect just isn't an all-or-nothing thing. We don't have anything at all to indicate that it is. It isn't as if this effect happens and then either all of the electrons are stripped or none of the electrons are stripped. It's a gradient. Therefore, we should see any indication that geologically relevant materials can have this happen to them, let alone that it did happen to them. But get this, even if we allot them the Z-pinch and the piezoelectric effect, even if we grant both of those things, we still have problems.
We would have lethal radiation. Even if the proposed mechanisms generated the needed accelerated decay rates, the massive radiation levels they generated would be more than lethal to humans and most other life forms. This is to say nothing of the dangerous electrical field that would be required to spur the loss of the electrons. I have heard before that the water that separates the seafloor and Noah on the boat would dilute the radiation enough to keep them safe in the moment, but the problem is nothing on Earth would be able to survive the deposition of said radiation in everything. And as it moved up the trophic levels, the problem would concentrate further. This is more of a delayed death, and that's assuming all of the heat is taken care of, which of course, it isn't.
We have yet to hear from Walt and company about the sloping pattern seen in our radiometrically dated rock.
None of his mechanisms, even when applied perfectly, can explain the overall sloping patterns of radiometric dates from the stratigraphically lowest to highest rocks, since his model holds that almost all sedimentary rocks were generated within a single year, meaning that even the oldest and youngest rocks would be separated by at most 6,000 years. Yet sloping patterns do exist and are well documented for several different dating methods.
We need methods too for the conflicting dates of the meteorites. Why do all of our meteorites date from 4.5 to 4.8 billion years old if they were all Earth rock ejected at the same time around the start of Noah's flood? Should they not all have some of the youngest dates, given they would have been ejected before the piezoelectric effect and Z-pinch began in full? Conflicting dates from the Moon and Mars also complicate things, as rocks from these bodies have been radiometrically dated from 3 to 4.5 billion years. If Brown believes that all meteorites came from Earth, which of course is not clear, then why do Mars meteorites and Moon meteorites differ? If he accepts that some did not come from Earth, then his mechanisms cannot account for these odd dates unless he envisions that there was a hydroplate flood on the Moon and Mars as well. Walt also has to deal with several independent radiometric dating methods that all seem to give the Earth a very, very old date of 4.5 to 4.8 billion years old. Those dates are also corroborated, and indeed many other radiometric dates are corroborated, by non-radiometric dating methods. Why do they all say that this rock of ours is so very ancient, when the piezoelectric effect, according to Walt Brown, only impacts the nuclear decay? In addition to all this superheated weirdness that is Hydroplate, we also have the claim that frozen Siberian mammoths are the result of all of that water coming back down in part as hail, capable of flash freezing animals. Our boys Bob Enyart and Brian Nickel have bravely decided to make a prediction about the frozen mammoths.
And Walt has an amazing prediction, number 25 in his book. The prediction is that directly beneath the frozen mammoths, there should be no marine fossils There also shouldn't be any stratified layers or coal or oil or limestone directly beneath any frozen mammoth.
Wow, this is an incredible prediction, a science prediction, and predictions are the hard currency of science. Walt is saying that wherever you find these undisturbed frozen mammoth carcasses, if you dig down, drill down, mine beneath them, you're not going to find, what's that list of, what does he predict that will not be found, Brian?
Because they were killed right at the beginning of the flood, pretty much where they stood, they shouldn't have any marine fossils underneath them. There shouldn't be any stratified layers that are flood layers underneath them. They would have pretty much been frozen to the ground, and there shouldn't be any coal or oil or limestone underneath.
Wow, this is a huge prediction because when you think of the scope, the geographic scope on the globe.
So let's wrap up. Walt details himself on his own website precisely the amount of energy that he believes would have been released as a result of every single aspect of the hydroplate hypothesis. So what does he have to say? What is our grand total straight from the horse's mouth? Quote, let us assume the total energy required was 2.2 times 10 raised 38 ERGs, unquote. A 1 megaton hydrogen bomb releases 4.184 times 10 raised 22 ERGs of energy. Therefore, it would take an explosion of 5,000 trillion 1 megaton hydrogen bombs to release 2.2 times 10 raised 38 ERGs of energy. So, an Earth's worth of TNT exploding was released according to the hydroplate theory, or about 10 megaton nuclear bombs going off per square meter of the entire surface of the Earth. For reference, Little Boy dropped on Hiroshima in World War II was 15 KT, so 10 megatons per square meter is about 600 Hiroshimas per square meter of the Earth. How much of this energy was absorbed by super heavy fusion? How much was not absorbed? Even if, say, 999 1,000ths of the energy is absorbed, that 1/1000th of remaining energy is sufficient to turn our entire atmosphere into plasma and melt the crust of the Earth. The heat problem burns young Earth creationism up into a crisp, the smoldering embers of which cry out with a depressingly genuine certainty that miracles simply must be the answer. Of course, as previously stated, this wretches creation science from its ramshackle throne of special pleading, poor methodology, and bogus papers, and violently suplexes it into the tar pit that is unsubstantiated claims. Our world is very, very, very old, and it's constantly changing thanks to the heat and pressure roiling beneath its own skin. By contrast, we are very new animals who stroll casually along the beaches made from the sea relentlessly pounding away at ancient cliffs millions upon millions of years ago. We form our monuments out of limestone, which are of course made of creatures much smaller and much older than the more enigmatic beasts that haunt our ideas of deep time. We look wistfully to the stars, unaware of just how much more of the deep annals of time these far-off stellar bodies really have seen, back from when our home was just a rock and the elements that make up our cities and our food and our ancestors and ourselves were still being forged in the belly of some distant star. Indeed, our world is very old, and I think that's pretty neat. Maybe someday some young Earth creationists will warm up to the idea, but for now they're stuck with a global flood and a very small snapshot of time, leaving their hypotheses on how things got to be the way that they are all washed up. Today's Sapiens Spotlight goes to Speed of Sound of Gravity. A very new channel, Speed of Sound of Gravity has already involved himself in many in-depth conversations regarding intelligent design and why it fails as a model. He also happens to know Standing for Truth in the gang. Go check him out with the link in the description. I would also like to take this opportunity to plug Nicholas Wennerholm, who is preparing his father's property to garden in order to donate to local food banks. He works the land by himself, but community contributions will allow him not only to increase production, but to turn the property into a rotating garden, which will provide food for the most vulnerable populations for many years to come. Check out his link in the description. This channel also supports The Sale of the Rocks Were There, a book written by James Downard and Jackson Weed that provides an army of sources and detailed refutations to classic creationist claims. The very generous Ian Chen, patron of the channel, had this book sent to me, and I love every page I've read so far.